All right, welcome back everyone to my channel. I hope everyone is doing fine. But let me ask you this. When was the last time you felt genuinely confident about where the US economy was headed? Not just uncertain, but actually confident that things were improving. Because if you're struggling to answer that question, you're not alone. Consumer sentiment in the United States just hit the lowest score ever recorded in the history of the University of Michigan's index. Not since the financial crisis, not since the pandemic, but the lowest ever. And the reason people feel that way isn't just vibes. There's a Zero Hedge article making the rounds right now, and I'll link it in the description below, that lays out 18 specific data points showing that the US economy is in far worse shape than the mainstream narrative is letting on. And this article includes numbers from government reports, from federal agencies, and from bank filings. Not opinion, but data. And when you read them together, the picture is stark. And so that's what we're going to break down today. What those 18 facts actually mean and why the pattern behind them matters more than any single number on its own. Now, before we get into it, if you care about understanding what's actually happening with money and the economy, not the spin, but the actual numbers, hit subscribe. We cover this stuff from a sound money and free market lens, and we don't soften the picture when the picture is bad. Now, without any further ado, let's dive right in. But before we get into specific data points, let me give you the frame to understand why all of this is happening at once. The US economy has been running on artificial fuel for over a decade. Low interest rates engineered by the Federal Reserve pushed money into assets, which includes stocks, real estate, and bonds, and encouraged consumers and businesses to borrow aggressively because money was cheap. When inflation finally showed up after the pandemic stimulus, the Fed was forced to raise rates sharply. And that's when the cracks started appearing. Now, from an Austrian economic standpoint, what we're witnessing right now is the bust phase of a classic boom-bust cycle. The artificially cheap credit of the 2010s and the early 2020s created malinvestment. People, businesses, and governments made financial decisions that only made sense when money was nearly free. Now that rates are higher and the real cost of borrowing has returned, those decisions are now unraveling. And the unraveling is showing up everywhere all at once. Now let's go through the data together. On the consumer side, I've already mentioned that consumer sentiment is the lowest ever recorded. Now that is not an abstract number. It reflects what 111 million Americans are experiencing directly. They cannot pay their credit card bills in full every month. And that is a new record. And the total credit card debt those people are carrying now exceeds $1 trillion. Most of them are approaching their credit limits, which means the buffer is gone and the next financial shock will hit them immediately. Now, at the same time, the cost of just existing has also risen sharply. A basket of basic groceries, which includes bread, eggs, meat, and everyday staples, costs 43% more today than it did in March 2019. Coffee prices have more than doubled since the pandemic. And here's one that captures the absurdity of where we are today. A pound of ground beef now costs more than the US federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour in many parts of the country. The federal minimum wage hasn't been updated since 2009. And that tells you everything about who the political class has been protecting, and it certainly isn't the workers. And housing is another pressure point. The median monthly cost of owning a home, which includes mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, has risen to over $2,800. That's a 72% increase in 6 years. For context, median household incomes in the US did not rise 72% in that period. So the gap between what housing costs and what people earn has widened dramatically. And the consequence? Foreclosures. In just the first 3 months of 2026, over 118,000 properties received foreclosure filings. That's 26% higher than the same period last year. Analysts are now drawing comparisons to the run up to 2008. Now, taking it over to the employment side, we know for a long time that the government has been messing with employment statistics and employment data. So let's avoid that entirely. Let's look at a completely different measure, underemployment. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York tracks what happens to recent college graduates. As of December 2025, 42.5% of college graduates aged 22 to 27 were underemployed, meaning they were working jobs that don't use their skills and typically pay a lower wage. That's the highest rate since 2020. You have an entire generation that did what they were told, which means get a degree, get a good job, and now almost half of them are stocking shelves or delivering food. And then additionally, the layoffs aren't slowing down either. Morgan Stanley, one of the largest banks in the world, cut 2,500 jobs. eBay laid off 800 workers, which constitutes 6% of its workforce, and Meta is reportedly planning to cut nearly 8,000 employees in an initial round, with more cuts expected later in the year. In the supply chain sector alone, nearly 4,000 workers were let go in recent weeks, from EV battery plants, auto parts factories, warehouses, and rail terminals. In April alone, the list of companies announcing layoffs includes Wells Fargo, C3.ai, Lucid Group, Charles River Laboratories, L3 Harris, and dozens more. On the retail side, Grocery Outlet is permanently closing 36 stores. Papa John's is shutting approximately 300 locations, and Wendy's is closing 5 to 6% of its North American stores. Hundreds of restaurants. These aren't minor corrections. These are chains with national footprints pulling back because consumer spending is deteriorating. Now, over on the structural side, here's the number that puts all of this in context and that almost nobody is talking about. On March 17th, 2026, the US Treasury released its fiscal year 2025 financial report. And buried in the data, you can find that the total unfunded obligations of the federal government now stand at a little over 130 trillion US dollars. That includes bonded debt plus the present value of projected shortfalls in Social Security, Medicare, and other social insurance programs calculated using the government's own accounting. Now, if you missed that number the first time, let me give it to you again. 130 trillion US dollars. For context, the entire US GDP is roughly 27 trillion US dollars. The national conversation is focused on the visible debt number, around 36 trillion dollars. But the actual liability is more than 3 times that. From an Austrian perspective, this is the endpoint of Keynesian style governance. Decades of spend now, pay later, inflate the currency when it gets tight, and defer the real cost to future generations. But the bill is now arriving. And with the Strait of Hormuz still disrupted by the Iran war, energy prices, which feed into everything from food production to transportation to manufacturing, are under serious upwards pressure. If that disruption continues, we're not looking at a soft landing, we're looking at the next downward leg of a very, very long correction. Now, the mainstream narrative is that the economy is weathering a rough period and things will stabilize. But when you look at the data together, consumer confidence at historic lows, foreclosures rising, credit card debt topping $1 trillion, retirement savings being liquidated, mass layoffs across every sector, and $130 trillion in unfunded government obligations, this doesn't look like just a rough patch. It looks like the accumulated cost of decades of artificial credit expansion finally coming due. Sound money isn't just a philosophical preference. It is what prevents exactly this scenario. When governments can print, borrow, and defer consequences indefinitely, these are exactly the outcomes. And understanding that is the first step to protecting yourself from it. And finally, if this video gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening, share it. Because most people are still getting a sanitized version of the news from the mainstream media. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your take in the comments section down below. Do you think this is just a rough patch or something more structural? Let's talk about it and see you in the next one.